All right, let's dive into this stack of notes and links you sent over about the Enlightenment. Looks like someone's been trying to get a handle on this whole age of reason thing.
Oh, it's a fascinating period, and you're right, tons to unpack. But that's what we're here for, right? To shed some light on this whole dare to know era.
You've got it. So, where do we even begin? It seems like every time I read something new about the Enlightenment, I uncover 10 more questions. What's the best way to approach this?
Well, first off, you've got to remember that this wasn't just about like a few dusty books and philosophers with bigwigs. This was a total revolution in thinking. We're talking about challenging the very core of how people saw themselves and the world, especially when it came to power and individual rights.
You're right, I've got challenging norms scribbled all over my notes. What exactly was shaking things up back in the 1700s?
Well, for centuries, people just accepted that monarchs ruled because, well, God said so. Divine right, they called it. Case closed.
Right, who's going to argue with God, right?
Yeah, exactly. But then along came these Enlightenment thinkers, and they're all like, hold on a minute. What if we applied reason, like that thing we use in science, to politics and society? It was like turning a telescope on themselves.
Talk about a change in perspective.
It was a total game changer. They started asking, what if government isn't about this God-given authority, but more like an agreement between the people and those in charge?
You talk about the social contract.
Bingo!
Yeah.
The social contract. This idea that we give up some freedoms in exchange for protection, order, a functioning society. You know the deal. But, and this is where it gets interesting, two guys, Hobbes and Locke, had radically different ideas about what this contract should actually look like.
Oh, philosophical showdown. I love it. Lay it on me. Who are these guys and what were their big ideas?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1651, England's still recovering from a nasty civil war, and this guy, Thomas Hobbes, publishes a book called Leviathan.
Leviathan.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
the sea monster.
Yep. He wasn't messing around. Hobbes had seen some stuff, and he was convinced that humans, at their core, are inherently selfish and power-hungry. Without a strong, absolute ruler to keep everyone in line, he figured we'd be at each other's throats in a chaotic, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short kind of world.
Wow, that's a cheerful thought.
Yeah, Hobbes was not exactly known for his optimism, but that's why he was all in on this idea of a Leviathan, this all-powerful sovereign, to maintain order and prevent anarchy.
Makes sense, given his rather dim view of human nature. So where does John Locke fit into all of this? He had a slightly different take on the social contract, right?
Totally different vibe with Locke. Fast forward a few decades, and Locke comes along, and he's got a bit more faith in humanity. He believed we're all born with these inherent rights, life, liberty, property, and that no government can take those away.
Sounds familiar. Those ideas definitely echo in a lot of modern democracies.
Absolutely. Locke's two treatises of government laid out this radical idea: government by consent of the governed. And here's the kicker. If the government violates the social contract, the people have the right to revolt.
Whoa, talk about a power shift.
Yeah.
So we've got Hobbes on team absolute ruler and Locke on team power to the people. What a clash of ideologies. But did these Enlightenment ideas stay stuck in the world of politics?
Oh, not even close. The Enlightenment was like this wildfire of new ideas, spreading beyond politics to science, art, even everyday life. Imagine smoky cafes buzzing with intellectuals, lively salons hosted by, get this, mostly women. They were hotbeds for discussing, debating, and dissecting every topic imaginable.
It's amazing to think about all these brilliant minds coming together. I'm picturing someone like Emily du Châtelet, this math and physics genius, holding court in a salon with Voltaire by her side. The conversations must have been mind-blowing.
Oh, they were the influencers of their day. But speaking of influential figures, we can't forget the rock stars of the Enlightenment. Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, these guys were the real deal.
Let's dive into these star philosophers and their big ideas. I've got Montesquieu down as a big fan of dividing things up. Why was that again?
He was all about separating powers. This guy, Montesquieu, publishes The Spirit of the Laws in 1748, where he argues that to prevent tyranny, you got to split that government power. No more all-powerful rulers. He wanted a system with different branches, each one keeping the others in check, that whole checks and balances thing we hear about.
Like the legislative, executive, and judicial branches we see today.
You got it. That's Montesquieu's influence right there in the U.S. and Canadian constitutions, to name a few.
Wow, talk about a lasting impact. Okay, so that's Montesquieu and his love of dividing power. Up next, Voltaire, the champion of free speech. I mean, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. How can you not love that?
He was fearless, a total badass. He took on intolerance and superstition head on, armed with nothing but his wit and his pen.
What a legend.
Yeah.
So, what's the catch? There's always a catch, right?
Yeah. Well, even the most enlightened minds can be, shall we say, products of their time. And Voltaire, for all his talk of liberty, had some views, especially about certain groups of people, that would make even the most hardened cynic cringe today.
Ah, the complexities of historical figures. Nobody's perfect, I guess, but still a fascinating and incredibly influential figure. Now, tell me more about Rousseau. He seemed to have some strong opinions on how society should work. What was his deal?
Rousseau, now there's a complex character for you. He's the one who gave us the general will. This idea that society functions best when individuals put the common good above their own selfish desires. His Social Contract, published in 1762, took it even further, arguing that this contract wasn't just between the people and the government, but also among individuals themselves.
So it's about more than just a government structure. It's about a social responsibility to each other.
Exactly. And Rousseau didn't shy away from challenging the status quo. He had some, let's call them progressive ideas about education and property, believing that too much emphasis on private property could actually be harmful, leading to inequality and all sorts of problems. Pretty radical stuff.
Wow, these Enlightenment thinkers really were covering all the bases, from government to social responsibility. Talk about a deep dive. It's incredible how these thinkers went from debating the very legitimacy of absolute rulers to questioning the very foundations of society itself.
And we're just getting started. We haven't even gotten to Beccaria and his revolutionary ideas about criminal justice reform. Now, considering the state of things back then, that's a whole other can of worms we need to open.
Oh man, I can only imagine. That does sound like a fascinating, albeit slightly darker, chapter of the Enlightenment. You're right, we can't just gloss over Beccaria. It's easy to get caught up in those big ideas about government and individual rights. But then you remember, like you said, the criminal justice system back then? Yikes. You've got on crimes and punishments highlighted in your notes, and I'm guessing things were pretty brutal back then, right?
Oh, you have no idea. I mean, we're talking torture as a routine way to get confessions, punishments that were completely arbitrary and often just plain cruel.
It's hard to even imagine that being considered normal.
It really is looking back from where we are now, but back then that was just how it was. And that's where Beccaria comes in, like a voice of reason in this, like barbaric system. He starts arguing for fairness, for proportionality, like punishments should actually fit the crime. The idea of a fair trial, speedy justice.
Those are things we take for granted now. But back then, those ideas were groundbreaking.
They were revolutionary. And the really crazy thing is how influential Beccaria became. I mean, we're talking about ideas that ended up in the U.S. Constitution.
Wait, seriously, the U.S. Constitution? What, like, specifically?
Think about it. The Eighth Amendment, that whole cruel and unusual punishment thing, that's Beccaria, right there in the Bill of Rights. And not just that the right of the accused, the right to a fair trial, these are all concepts that he championed.
It's incredible how those ideas, born out of that period, became so fundamental to how we think about justice today.
I know, right? It really makes you realize that these weren't just some abstract ideas floating around in the ether. They had real-world consequences. They literally shaped societies.
It's a good reminder that the Enlightenment, with all its talk about reason and progress, wasn't always pretty. Especially, I'd imagine, if you weren't a man.
Yeah, that's the other thing, right? We keep talking about these brilliant minds. And don't get me wrong, they were brilliant. But for the most part, it was a total boys' club. Even with someone like Emily du Châtelet making waves in math and physics, women were still mostly relegated to the sidelines.
It's a shame, but probably not all that surprising considering the times. But they weren't completely silent, were they? You've got Mary Wollstonecraft in your notes, and she sounds like a total rock star.
Oh, Wollstonecraft. She was a force of nature. We're talking 1792, and she publishes this scathing critique of how society treats women, a vindication of the rights of women.
Okay, what was so radical about it?
Well, imagine saying back then that women deserved the same education as men, the same rights, the same opportunities. She argued that women are just as capable of reason as men, that they should have a say in how they're governed, and that they shouldn't be stuck in those, like, predefined roles that society tries to impose on them.
Man, she was really ahead of her time. I bet that didn't go over so well in certain circles.
You think? It was scandalous. People were like, what is this woman talking about? But you see, that's the thing about ideas. Once they're out there, they can't really be put back in the
So,
box.
like, even if Wollstonecraft didn't see immediate change, she planted the seeds for the future.
Exactly. Those ripples are still being felt today. Her writing became a foundation for the women's rights movement that really gained traction in the centuries that followed. It's a good reminder that progress isn't always like this straight line upwards. Sometimes it's about planting those seeds, even if you don't get to see them fully bloom.
Wow, talk about a legacy. Speaking of legacies, how did these Enlightenment ideas even spread? It wasn't all just books and pamphlets, right? We talked about salons earlier. How big of a role did those actually play?
Oh, huge. Think of them like, I don't know, the 18th century version of social media, a place where intellectuals could gather, share ideas, debate, gossip, you name it. And get this, women were often the ones running the show, organizing these salons, and using their social influence to shape the conversation.
So it wasn't just about those big names we hear about. There was this whole network of people, especially women, who were spreading these ideas and making things happen behind the scenes.
Exactly. They were the original influencers. But of course, we can't forget about the printed word. I mean, you can't talk about the spread of knowledge in the Enlightenment without talking about Diderot and his crazy, ambitious project.
You're talking about that whole encyclopedia to end all encyclopedias thing?
Yeah.
That sounds intense.
Intense is an understatement. This wasn't just any encyclopedia, this was a massive undertaking, a compilation of all human knowledge, meticulously organized and illustrated. It was like the Google of the 18th century, 28 volumes of knowledge, accessible to anyone who could get their hands on them.
And that was the revolutionary
Yeah.
front, right? Making knowledge accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy and the elite.
Exactly. It was this radical notion of democratizing knowledge, challenging those traditional power structures. Imagine the impact that must have had, suddenly having access to information that was previously reserved for, scholars and the aristocracy.
Talk about a game changer. So we've got salons buzzing, books and pamphlets flying off the shelves, knowledge spreading like wildfire. I can only imagine how the folks in charge, the kings and queens of Europe, felt about all this.
Well, let's just say they weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of their authority being challenged. Remember, this was still the age of absolute monarchs.
Right. Those guys weren't exactly known for their power to the people attitude. So how did they react to this new world order? Did they just throw in the towel and say, okay, you win, democracy for all?
Not quite. But here's where things get interesting. Some of these monarchs, while not quite ready to give up their thrones, were kind of intrigued by these new Enlightenment ideas. They became known as the enlightened despots.
Enlightened despots. That seems a little contradictory, doesn't it? How can you be a someone with absolute power, and be enlightened? Were they for real, or was it just a way to hold on to power?
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? These rulers, like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, figured out that by adopting some of these Enlightenment principles, they could actually strengthen their own rule, make their countries more modern and efficient.
So, like, a little bit of reform here, a little bit of absolute power there. It sounds like a delicate balancing act. But did they actually achieve anything meaningful? Or was it all just for show?
Well, some more than others. Frederick the Great, for example, was a big proponent of education. He actually corresponded with Voltaire. Can you imagine those letters?
Mm.
And saw himself as this, like, first servant of the state, which is a very Enlightenment-y way of thinking about leadership.
Wow, that's pretty radical for an absolute monarch.
Yeah.
But did he abolish serfdom? I feel like that would be the true test of his commitment to Enlightenment ideals.
That's the thing with these enlightened despots. There were always limits to their enlightenment, especially when those ideals clashed with their own power.
So did he or didn't he?
Well, Frederick recognized that serfdom was unjust, but he couldn't bring himself to abolish it completely. He felt like he needed the support of the nobility, the landowners, and they weren't exactly clamoring for change on that front. It's a good reminder that even the most well-intentioned leaders are products of their time. They have to work within the existing power structures, and sometimes those structures are deeply resistant to change. So what about Catherine the Great? Any luck with serfdom over in Russia?
Catherine the Great, huh? Trying to ride that wave of enlightenment while also being the absolute ruler of Russia sounds like a tough balancing act. Did she manage to make those ideals work for her? And what about serfdom? Did she actually do anything about it?
Well, she definitely liked to surround herself with Enlightenment thinkers. I mean, she exchanged letters with Voltaire and Diderot, commissioned those grand palaces and universities. She even called serfdom regrettable, like she knew it was messed up.
Okay, so she's saying the right things, at least to some people. But was she actually walking the walk?
It's complicated. On the one hand, she implemented some reforms, like trying to improve education and codify laws. But when it came to the big stuff, like truly challenging the power of the nobility, she backed down.
So no abolishing serfdom.
Nope. In fact, she ended up siding with the nobles, even brutally crushing a peasant uprising. I guess when it came down to it, she realized that her own power depended on their support. It's easy to talk about lofty ideals, but when you're sitting on a throne, it's a whole different ballgame.
So much for the enlightened part of enlightened despot. It's a little disheartening, to be honest, seeing those ideals crumble when they clash with real-world power dynamics. Makes you wonder if we really made any progress at all.
I know what you mean. It's a good reminder that the Enlightenment wasn't some fairy tale where everyone saw the light and embraced reason and justice overnight. It was a messy, complicated process, full of contradictions and setbacks. But even with those setbacks, the ideas themselves were transformative. And don't forget, the Enlightenment was happening alongside this whole scientific revolution that was turning people's understanding of the universe upside down.
Right. It's like those scientific discoveries gave people the tools and the courage to question everything else. Like, hey, if we can figure out how gravity works, maybe we can figure out this whole society thing too.
It's like they realized that the universe wasn't just this, like, unknowable mystery controlled by fate or divine whims. There were laws, there were principles, and you could understand them through reason and observation. And once you start thinking like that about the natural world, it's hard not to apply that same logic to everything
It's
else.
like that famous Kant quote, dare to know. It's about embracing the power of your own reason, challenging dogma, and never being afraid to ask why.
Exactly. And that spirit of inquiry, that belief in the power of reason to understand the world and to make it better, that's the true legacy of the Enlightenment, if you ask me.
I think you're right. It wasn't just about having all the answers. It was about having the courage to ask the questions in the first place.
Not the answer.
It's like we've been on this whirlwind tour through history, from those smoky salons where these radical ideas were being debated to the palaces of monarchs grappling with a changing world. But where does it leave us today? What are we supposed to do with this knowledge, with the legacy of the Enlightenment and all its complexities?
Well, it's tempting to pat ourselves on the back and say, look how far we've come. And don't get me wrong, in a lot of ways we have. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we're still grappling with those same questions those Enlightenment thinkers were wrestling with centuries ago. How do we create a just and equitable society? What does true freedom look like? And how do we balance individual liberty with the needs of the community? How do we ensure that power, in all its forms, is used responsibly?
So the age of reason didn't magically solve all our problems.
Maybe not, but it did give us a framework for thinking about those problems, for asking the tough questions, for continuing that conversation. And that's where we come in, right?
So it's an ongoing process, an
Um,
unfinished symphony, you could say.
Exactly. And it's up to each of us to pick up the baton, to engage with these ideas, to challenge our own assumptions, and to never stop asking those difficult questions. Who knows? Maybe by doing that, we can, in our own small way, contribute to creating a more enlightened world.
On that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Enlightenment. We've covered a lot of ground, from the salons of Paris to the palaces of Russia. And it's clear that this era, with all its complexities and contradictions, continues to shape our world in profound ways. We hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as we have, but more importantly, we hope it sparked some new questions and maybe even inspired you to do some digging of your own. Because ultimately, the quest for knowledge, for a more enlightened world, is a journey that never really ends.